The winter of 1912 clamped down on the eastern frontier like a slow-moving beast, exhaling cold through every crack in the mountains and every hollowed path between the jagged ridges. Snow had fallen for 3 days without pause, layering itself over rooftops, fences, and the crooked chimney stacks of a forgotten village hidden in the valley. At dawn, when the fog drifted low enough to touch the frozen ground, the world looked suspended in silence, as if sound itself had been swallowed by the season. Only the faint groan of which shrinking in the cold hinted that life still persisted there. The villagers had grown used to this muteness, but for Elias more of the quiet had a different weight. It pressed on his chest like a reminder of everything he had failed to save. Inside his workshop, the cold fought against the heat of the forge, creating a wavering haze that kept the air thick and bitter. The smell of charcoal and burned metal clung to every beam, every tool, every inch of ground. Elias worked with sleeves rolled to the elbow, despite the temperature, because the rhythm of the hammer was the only thing that kept his mind from drifting into places he did not want to visit. Each strike against the glowing steel came with a pulse of memory, his brother's voice laughing, his brother's breath fading, his brother's body limp in his arms after the unrecognized military raid that had torn to the valley years before. The Empire had denied it ever happened. The officials wrote it off as a bandit attack. But Elias had seen the uniforms, had seen the insignias half torn from coats, had seen precision of the assault no bandit group could ever achieve. And since that night, the guilt had settled inside him like iron cooling too fast, brittle, unyielding, ready to snap. People in the village rarely spoke to him beyond purchasing nails, horseshoes, or repair hinges. They treated him with a polite distance reserved for someone who had lost too much and could not put it down. Some muttered that he was strange. Others whispered that grief had hollowed him out. None guessed the truth. That grief had sharpened him instead, turning him into something harder, quieter, and far more deliberate. He lived alone in the workshop behind his small house, spending long hours reshaping discarded scrap into tools no one asked for, modifying old mechanisms, experimenting with vibration patterns that only he could sense through the touch of metal. He never explained these side projects. He barely understood why he built them. He only knew that creating things kept him from collapsing into the memory of the night he failed his brother. That winter morning, as snow piled against the door, distant murmurs stirred the streets. Rumors had crawled into the valley from passing traders and terrified farmers fleeing from the east. An army, massive, organized, relentless, was advancing. It had already swallowed towns, seized farms, and burned anything that could offer resistance. Their commanders had been granted new authority to annex the frontier lands, and the imperial expansion, long ignored by the central government, was suddenly becoming brutal. The villagers clung to hope that the rumors were exaggerated. But Elias knew better. Military movements always preceded official announcements. The Empire acted first, justified later. By midday, the mayor called a gathering near the old well, where snow lay trampled in chaotic patterns. Breath fogged in the air as people huddled in thick coats, their faces pale with fear. Elias stood at the edge, arms crossed, listening without interest to the worried voices. What could the mayor possibly say that mattered? They had no trained fighters, no supply stockpiles, no strategy. The Empire did not negotiate with villages like theirs. It consumed them. Yet as he watched the panic ripple through the crowd, he felt something unexpected. A faint, sharp sting of responsibility. It wasn't duty toward the village. It wasn't loyalty. It was a memory of his brother's hand clutching his sleeve during those final moments, the whisper that he had promised to protect him, the promise he had broken. If he left the village now, fled into mountains, he would repeat the same mistake. Another absence, another failure. But if he stayed, he breathed out slowly, knowing the truth before he admitted it. Staying meant dying. The mayor's voice trembled. We cannot defend ourselves. We must evacuate as soon as possible. A tense murmur spread. Families looked at the few belongings they could carry. Old men glanced toward the mountains, already imagining climb. Elias turned away. Evacuation was the same as surrender, and surrender would not stop the Empire's march. He walked back to his workshop, boots crunching in deep snow, the cold biting through his coat. Inside, he shut the door against the wind. The forge glowed dimly, its heat pulsing gently. He leaned both hands on the anvil, breathing hard. The idea surfaced slowly, like a shape emerging through fog. It was absurd. A tool he had once modified for no reason other than curiosity. Something fragile. Something born of scraps. Something worth no more than $3 in material. It was laughable to consider it a weapon. And yet, as the memory of its strange vibration returned to him, he felt a flicker of possibility. He knelt by an old crate buried beneath other abandoned projects and pulled out the device. It was small, rough, and ugly, a handle made of leftover oak, a set of uneven metal plates fused together, and a simple mechanism he had altered long ago to amplify impact through directional resonance. At the time, he dismissed it as a failed experiment. But now, with the storm of fear gathering outside, it called to him like an unfinished apology. He tested the mechanism with a tap of his finger, feeling the faint, hidden pulse within the plates. Something awakened, a vibration he could sense through bone and breath, subtle yet promising. The forge crackled behind him, casting shadows across the walls like shifting ghosts. He inhaled deeply. Maybe he could shape this failure into something else, something with purpose, something that might finally let him stand his ground. For the first time in years, he felt a stir of resolve. He placed the device on the work table, and he began to work. Night settled over the valley like a dark sheet pulled taut across the sky, but Elias did not feel the passage of hours. The forge's glow flickered across his face, warming the frozen lines around his eyes as he worked with focus so absolute that even the cold seemed reluctant to intrude. Sparks leapt from the anvil every time metal met metal, each burst lighting the workshop like a momentary sunrise. Outside, the wind howled against the shutters, but Elias hardly noticed. The only rhythm that mattered was the steady beat of his hammer, a pattern that carried the echo of his brother's voice, calm, teasing, alive. Each strike seemed to draw that voice closer, as if the memory itself were guiding his hands. He reworked the plates first, thinning them strategically to allow for maximum vibration. The resonance had always been the key, though he had never intended to weaponize it. Originally, the mechanism was meant to improve striking efficiency on agricultural equipment, distributing force in a way that reduced labor. At least, that had been the idea before the world had swallowed his future and left him alone in the forge with only unfinished projects for company. Now the concept found new purpose in desperation. By directing the impact into the rock walls of the mountain pass, he believed he could amplify it far beyond its natural potential. Not enough to kill, he knew, but enough to disrupt, enough to break formation, enough to sow confusion where the enemy least expected it. He paused only when his hands began to ache from the cold seeping through the gloves. He flexed his fingers, knuckles popping softly, and glanced toward the small window. Snow drifted thickly outside, almost glowing in the faint moonlight. It made the valley look peaceful, almost beautiful, despite the danger crawling steadily closer. He imagined the approaching army marching with torches and banners, their disciplined ranks cutting through the land like a purposeful tide. Once, before his brother died, he might have felt awe at such military precision. Now, he felt only the slow burn of resentment. The villagers tried to sleep, but fear kept most awake. Elias heard distant voices through the snow, people arguing, praying, crying. Their terror hovered over the village like a second storm. He tried to shut it out. Emotions had no place in what he was building. If he let fear in, even for a moment, doubt would follow, and doubt would undo everything. He tightened the final bolt and lifted the device to inspect it under the forge light. It looked no more impressive than when he started, rough and uneven, but he felt the hum through his palm, a stronger, deeper vibration now, as if the plates recognized their purpose. Elias set it down carefully and stepped back. He exhaled slowly. A tool, he reminded himself. This is only a tool. Its power would depend entirely on how he used it, and he would have only one chance. He extinguished the forge and let the room go dim. As the embers faded, the quiet returned, the old quiet, the heavy quiet that carried memories like anchors. He felt his brother's absence sharply then, like a blade pressed into the ribs. If you could see me now, he thought, if you could see how far I've fallen, or how far I'm trying to climb back, He wondered whether his brother would approve of this desperate attempt or whether he would tell him to run, to survive. But the memory never spoke. It only watched him from the shadows of the past. Before dawn, Elias left the workshop and stepped into the frigid air. Snow had piled high against the door, forcing him to push hard to break free. The world felt unnaturally still, as if the valley itself were holding its breath. He could sense movement far beyond the mountains. The methodical march of soldiers, the distant echo of boots on frozen soil, the shift in wind caused by the advance of something enormous. The army was close now, too close. When he walked through the village, he saw faces peering from windows, pale silhouettes watching him pass. Some recognized him and stared with startled confusion, as if unsure why the local ferrero was venturing out before dawn, carrying nothing but a satchel and a wrapped bundle. Others turned away, unwilling to acknowledge that someone might be walking toward danger while everyone else prepared to flee. Elias did not hold it against them. Fear was a natural instinct, but for him, fear had already taken everything. There was nothing left for it to steal. He reached the edge of the village and followed the narrow trail, winding upward into the mountains. The path was steep, carved between tall rock walls streaked with ice. He had walked it many times before, usually to gather ore or inspect stone deposits, but never with the weight he carried now. Not the weight of the satchel, but the weight of decision. Every step felt like a thread unspooling behind him, marking a line he could not cross again. Once he reached the pass, there would be no retreat. Either his plan would work, or he would die alone in the snow, swallowed by the mountains like so many nameless souls before him. Halfway up the trail, exhaustion began to press on him. The cold stung his lungs, and the climb forced his muscles to burn. He stopped briefly, leaning against a rock to catch his breath. Below him, the valley stretched out like a sleeping creature wrapped in frost. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, the last warmth the villagers might experience before everything changed. He wondered if any of them would remember him kindly, or if he would simply become another casualty of imperial ambition. As he climbed higher, the skies slowly brightened with the faint gray of morning. The first light revealed the narrow mouth of the pass ahead, a natural bottleneck between towering cliffs. Elias knew the terrain well. The acoustics here were strange. Sounds echoed longer, deeper, bending in unexpected ways. It was the perfect place to try what no one believed possible. The perfect place for a single man to challenge an army, if only for a moment. He reached the pass and stood quietly at its center, snow crunching softly beneath his boots. He could feel the cold wind rushing between the cliffs, carrying faint vibrations that hinted at movement beyond. The army was approaching. Hours, maybe less. Elias unwrapped the device and held it firmly, testing the grip, feeling the metal pulse with the subtle, resonant heartbeat he had engineered. He breathed in the frozen air, steady and calm. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity, not peace, but purpose. He would not run. He would not hide. He would face what was coming. And whatever happened here would define the rest of his life, whether it ended today or carried on into another uncertain dawn. The first signs of the advancing army reached the mountain pass not through sight, but through the ground. Elias felt it before he heard it. A faint tremor beneath the snow, a subtle shifting of the earth, like a restless pulse echoing through the rock bed. He knelt and pressed a gloved hand to the ground. The vibration was steady, rhythmic, unmistakable. Marching boots. Dozens at first, then hundreds. The kind of synchronized movement only a trained force could maintain. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the tremor travel through him. It felt like a storm carried on bone instead of air. When the sound followed, it came as a distant rumble, muffled by the snow-packed cliffs, but powerful enough to shake loose tiny avalanches from the ledges above. Elias rose slowly. This was no longer rumor, no longer fear. It was reality, heavy and undeniable, cresting over the edge of the world like a dark tide. He positioned himself halfway down the incline of the pass, where the cliffs bent inward and created a natural pocket of echo. It was here he had practiced striking stone for years, sometimes without realizing what he was doing, testing sound, studying how impact traveled across surfaces, listening to how the cliffs responded. All those strange experiments he'd done while running from his grief were suddenly assembled in his mind like pieces of a single design. The idea frightened him with its clarity. It was the first time since his brother's death that something felt right. The rumble grew louder. Soon, he heard the clatter of harnesses, the metallic ring of weapons, and the deep, coordinated shouts of officers issuing commands. When the first shapes appeared at the far end of the pass, Elias felt his breath tighten. They emerged slowly, a line of scouts, followed by infantry marching in perfect rows, spears and rifles glinting in the pale morning light. The soldiers were wrapped in thick imperial uniforms, their faces set in stone-like calm. Behind them rose banners carrying the crest of the Central Command. This was not a wandering patrol. This was the vanguard of a full thrust toward annexation. Elias stood alone, a dark figure in the snow, his breath forming small, fleeting clouds. The soldiers noticed him quickly. A few slowed, frowning at the sight of a single man blocking the way. One officer stepped forward, raising a hand as if signaling the others to halt. His voice echoed sharply through the pass. "You there! Step aside." Elias didn't move. "Step aside, or you will be removed." The officer barked again, irritation rising when the lone figure remained silent. More soldiers spilled into the pass behind him, forming a dense cluster of bodies and weapons. The sheer number of them was suffocating. Elias felt a familiar surge of fear prickling at the edge of his thoughts, threatening to pull him under. He pushed it down, locking onto the steady hum of the device in his hand. He shouted back, his voice cracking slightly from the cold. "Turn around. Leave this valley." The army laughed, a low, rolling wave of amusement. The officer shook his head, lips curling. "Move," he said coldly. "You are outnumbered, out-armed, and out of time." Elias lifted the device. He felt the vibration travel through his palm, climbing up his arm like a living current. He angled it toward the cliffside, aligning it with the natural hollows in the rock, the same ones he had mapped by instinct over the years, listening to their strange acoustic responses. The soldiers paused, uncertain now, a lone man raising a crude, ugly tool hardly seemed like a threat, but there was something unsettling about his stillness. Elias inhaled deeply. The memory came unbidden. His brother calling out to him the night of the raid, the flash of torchlight, the sound of steel tearing through the darkness. The weight of that loss pressed against him like an invisible hand, steadying him, anchoring him. He struck. The device hit the rock with a force far beyond its size. The impact sent a sharp, metallic note through the pass, a piercing vibration that rang out like a bell struck by lightning. The cliffs quivered. Snow shook loose in sheets. The ground trembled beneath hundreds of boots. The soldiers staggered, taken off guard by the sudden, unnatural resonance. Elias struck again. This time the sound deepened, blooming outward in a low, thunderous wave. It bounced between the cliffs, multiplying in strength as it ricocheted. Soldiers clutched their helmets. Some stumbled, dropping weapons as a vibration rattled through their bones. Horses reared wildly, panicked by the echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Hold formation!" An officer screamed, but the words were swallowed by the rumbling chorus of the vibrating cliffs. Elias felt the resonance building, a rolling surge of sound and force, exactly as he had imagined in the long hours of forging. He aligned the device for the third strike, aware that this blow had to be perfect. One mistake, and the amplified feedback could rebound uncontrollably. One error, and the cliffs might collapse on top of him. He gritted his teeth. He struck the rock with every ounce of strength left in his body. The explosion of sound was immediate and overwhelming. A shock wave ripped through the pass like a physical thing, a wall of vibration that tore through the air, shattering the soldiers' cohesion. Rows crumpled. Weapons clattered onto stone. Officers were thrown off their feet. Horses bolted in terror, crashing into ranks and scattering men. The formation broke apart in seconds, dissolving into chaos as soldiers scrambled to escape the echoing fury bouncing between the cliffs. Elias staggered back from the force, breath ripped from his lungs, ears ringing, but he stayed on his feet. He had expected the backlash. The soldiers hadn't. He watched as confusion spread through the ranks, turning a disciplined army into a panicked mass stumbling over itself, retreating from a sound they couldn't see or understand. The shock wave had done its job, Not by killing, but by overwhelming, by destabilizing, by terrorizing. The officers rallied as best they could, shouting frantic orders. But the men were already breaking. A full retreat rippled backward the line like a collapsing wall. Elias stood alone in the snow, chest heaving, the device trembling faintly in his grip. His hands shook from the impact, his arms numb. But he remained upright, watching the enemy withdraw, step by step, until the pass slowly fell silent. He lowered the device. For the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him. Not triumph, not relief, but the beginning of something he had thought lost forever. A sense of possibility. The silence that followed the retreat felt unreal, as if the mountain pass itself were unsure whether the chaos had truly ended. Elias remained still for several breaths, listening to the faint echo of the last panicked footsteps fading into the distance. Snow drifted down in slow, quiet spirals around him, settling on the churned ground where hundreds of soldiers had stood only minutes earlier. His arms trembled from the exertion, his muscles burning, the lingering shock of the device's final strike buzzing faintly through his bones. But he was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he was still standing. He leaned against the rock wall, closing his eyes as the cold seeped into his skin, grounding him. The device hung loosely from his hand, no longer vibrating. The resonance had nearly torn apart on that last blow. Thin cracks now spidered across its metal plates, and the handle felt warm, almost feverish, as if the tool itself were exhausted. Elias ran his thumb along the damaged edge, feeling the roughness. It had done more than it was ever built to do. He wondered, briefly and strangely, if it had known. His breath clouded in front of him, fading quickly in the icy air. He raised his gaze toward the far end of the pass, half expecting the army to regroup and charge back. But there was no movement, only scattered equipment left behind. Helmets, drop packs, a twisted spear, a rifle half buried in snow. The pass had become an accidental graveyard of fear, not of men. When Elias finally made his way down the slope, his legs felt heavy and unstable. The adrenaline that fueled him began to drain, replaced by a deep, raw ache that spread through his chest. It wasn't pain. It was something older, something that had lived inside him since that night years ago when he failed to protect his brother. For a fleeting moment, he felt the old guilt reach for him again, like a familiar hand closing around his throat. But the grip was weaker this time. The weight had changed. On the final curve before the trail opened back into the valley, he stopped. The view stretched wide beneath him. The village lying silent in the snow, chimneys still smoking faintly, and beyond at the long valley floor where the army had entered. He expected to see flames, destruction, bodies. But the soldiers had not made it that far. His strike had turned them back before they could descend. A strange heaviness settled over him. Not relief, not pride, but disbelief. He had halted an army, alone, with a tool barely worth $3. It didn't seem possible. It felt like a story someone else had lived. Someone braver, someone stronger. Surely his brother would have been that someone, not him. He forced himself to continue down toward the village, each step slow, almost hesitant. The snow had thickened, blanketing the ground in a clean, untouched layer. The valley looked peaceful again, too peaceful, as if the world had closed over the violence he had unleashed, leaving no trace. When he reached the outskirts, he noticed faces peeking from behind shutters, others from doorways. People stared at him with wide, bewildered eyes. Some looked afraid, unsure what they were seeing. Others looked as though they wanted to speak, but couldn't form the words. The quiet pressing around him as he walked through the main path, his boots leaving dark imprints in the snow. At the center of the village, near the old well, a crowd began to gather. They approached him slowly, unsure if they should or not. Among them was the mayor, who had earlier urged everyone to flee. His expression was difficult to read, a blend of shock, confusion, and something very close to shame. "Elias," the mayor said softly. "What happened up there?" Elias stopped. The crowd pressed closer, though still keeping a respectful distance, as if he were something volatile, unpredictable. Snowflakes clung to his hair and his coat. He felt exhausted, hollowed out. "They're gone," he said simply. A murmur rippled through the villagers. disbelief giving way to astonished whispers. Someone stepped forward, Marta, the baker's wife, her voice trembling. "You drove them away?" "By yourself." He hesitated. "I stopped them," he answered after a moment. "Just long enough. They weren't ready for pass." Another voice, shaky and breathless. "But how? With what?" Elias looked down at the device in his hand. The crude plates, the splintering handle, the cracked mechanism. It looked even more pathetic now in the daylight. It certainly didn't look like something capable of scattering an army. "Just something I made," he said. The villagers exchanged uncertain glances. Some laughed nervously, unable to believe him. Others stared at the device as though it were a cursed object. But then, slowly, people began to step closer, not toward the tool, but toward Elias. Their expressions shifted from confusion to something else. Cautious admiration, gratitude, even respect. Warmth flickered in their eyes, tentative and fragile. Elias felt the attention pressing against him, uncomfortable and heavy. He wasn't used to this. People looking at him, really looking at him, not as a strange, quiet Ferrero buried in his grief, but as someone who had done something that mattered. He wanted to shrink away from it, but he also felt something quieter beneath that discomfort, something he didn't quite recognize at first, a soft flicker of acceptance, not from them, but from within himself. The mayor stepped forward, his voice steadier now. "You saved us." Elias lowered his gaze. "No, I just didn't run." But that answer seemed to deepen the villagers' admiration rather than diminish it. More people stepped forward, offering hesitant thanks, some placing hands over their hearts, others simply nodding, as if acknowledging something long overlooked. Elias felt overwhelmed. He shook his head and stepped back. "I need to rest," he said quietly. The crowd parted for him as he walked toward his workshop. Snow continued to fall, covering the footprint behind him. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, letting the warm shadows swallow him. Only then did he realize his hands were shaking uncontrollably, not from fear or exhaustion, but from the enormity of what had happened. He set the damaged device gently on the table and sank onto a stool, elbows on his knees, head bowed. The forge had gone cold, dark embers lying beneath ash. In the silence, he felt the weight inside him shift again, the guilt loosening, the grief softening, the years of isolation cracking open just enough to let warmth back in. For the first time since his brother's death, Elias allowed himself to breathe without pain. But the day was not done with him yet, because what he had done in the past, the impossible, unbelievable act of one man against an army, was already beginning to spread beyond the village. And consequences, he knew, always came. The story of the lone Ferrero in the mountain pass spread faster than Elias could have imagined. It moved from house to house before noon, then from village to village by dusk. Travelers passing through carried it further, adding fragments of myth to the truth. Some claim Elias had wielded a weapon that glowed red as fire. Others insisted the mountains themselves had risen to defend him, echoing his strikes like thunder. By the next morning, the tale had already taken on the shape of legend, but Elias cared little for rumors. His world remained small. The forge, the snow, the quiet breath of the valley as it tried to return to normal. He slept deeply for the first time in years, though dreams stirred beneath the surface. Images of the past shaking under his feet, the explosive resonance of the final strike, his brother's face lit by fire and memory. He awoke before dawn, when the sky was still a dull shade of blue. For a moment, he didn't move. The weight inside him felt different, not lighter, but balanced, as if the grief had shifted into a new place, one that no longer crushed him. He rose, washed the soot from his hands, and stepped outside. The village was silent, blanketed in fresh snow that sparkled faintly under the early light. His breath formed thin clouds. For a few minutes, he simply stood there, listening to the quiet. The mountains loomed in the distance, their jagged peaks turning amber under the sunrise. The same mountains that had once swallowed his brother's last moments now seemed still, almost watchful. He walked the workshop and lit the forge. Flames caught, glowing hot and orange, filling the room with warmth. The familiar crackle of fire welcomed him like an old friend. But when he looked at the device on the table, cracked, bent, half-scorched, He felt a faint pang. It had done its job. It had accomplished more than it ever should have. Now its purpose was finished. Elias picked it up carefully. The metal was cold, fragile, no longer humming with potential. He turned it over in his hands, examining the wear and damage. It would never be used again. Even repairing it would risk destroying the memory of what had done. He placed it gently on a shelf, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what grief, determination, and desperation can create in the hands of someone who refuses to surrender. By midday, the village had returned to life. People moved cautiously at first, unsure whether the army might circle back. But scouts reported no sign of soldiers anywhere nearby. The troops had retreated so far and so fast that even their distant presence seemed unlikely. Still, tension lingered. People glanced over their shoulders more often, listened to the wind a bit too carefully. When Elias stepped into the village center to gather supplies, conversations halted around him. Dozens of eyes followed his every move, some filled with awe, others with gratitude, a few with fear, not of him, but of what he had dared to do. He paused near the well when a group of children approached him timidly. One held out a small wooden carving of a hammer, rough and uneven. "For you," the child said. Elias stared at it, unsure how to respond. He accepted it slowly. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than he intended. The children smiled and ran off. Adults watched with quiet respect. Someone tried to clap him on the shoulder, but he stepped back instinctively. The gesture wasn't unkind. He simply wasn't ready. After making his purchases, he turned to leave, but the mayor intercepted him. The man's expression was solemn but warm. "The council met this morning," the mayor said. "We would like to offer you a position of leadership, someone who can help guide the village's defenses, someone who has proven—" "No," Elias interrupted gently. The mayor blinked, thrown off. "No." Elias shook his head. "I'm not a leader. What happened, it was necessary. But it isn't who I am." "But you saved us," the mayor insisted. "And now you'll rebuild," Elias replied. "You'll fortify the valley. Prepare yourselves. The empire may not return now, but it will remember this. My place is in the forge. That's where I can help most." The mayor held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded with quiet understanding. Leadership was not something one imposed on a man like Elias. It had to be chosen. And Elias had already chosen where he belonged. He returned to the workshop as snowflakes began falling again, drifting lazily from the steel-colored sky. The valley grew silent once more, but this silence felt different. Not frightened or tense, but alive, expectant. Elias spent the afternoon crafting new tools for villagers, reinforced hinges, sturdier axes, metal braces for wagons. His movements were calm, steady. The rhythm of the hammer felt different now, less like an escape, more like a heartbeat. He no longer hammered against ghosts. He hammered for the future. As the day faded, he stepped outside to watch the snowfall. The forge behind him pulsed with warm light, casting his shadow long across the white ground. A few villagers passed nearby, heading home. They greeted him, not with fear or hesitation, but with quiet nods that carried genuine respect. Elias answered with a nod of his own. He thought of his brother then, not with pain, but with clarity. He imagined him standing beside him in the snow, grinning that crooked grin, shaking his head at how absurd and impossible everything had been. Elias felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth. For the first time, the memory didn't hurt. Night settled gently over the valley. The snowfall thickened, muting the world under a soft white veil. Elias turned back toward the workshop, pausing at the doorway. The forge's glow spilled out into the cold, warm and alive, like a heartbeat in the darkness. One man against an empire, a weapon worth $3, a strike that echoed through stone, through history, the quiet ache of a grief finally laid to rest. Elias stepped inside, closed the door, and returned to the anvil. The forge crackled behind him, steady and bright, carving light into the night. Some legends grow loud. His grew quietly, hammer by hammer, flame by flame, one steady breath at a time.